for our third panel today, which is going to be looking at the economy and net zero. And here to moderate and lead the discussion, it is my pleasure to introduce Shelley Gilberg, National ESG Markets Leader and Canadian Platforms Leader at PwC Canada. Shelley, thank you very much for joining us today. I'll turn things over to you now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Catherine, for having me. And I get the pleasure on this panel of having several of our real economy leaders in terms of net zero and the energy transition with us today. So I will start sort of in the order of my screen, which is Mike Munoz, who is Vice President of External Relations for Suncor. Welcome, Mike. Trevor McLeod, who is the Director of ESG and Public Policy at Enbridge, and we're happy to have you today, Trevor. Leah Turner, the Director of Public Affairs for Tourmaline Oil Corporation, and last but certainly not least, Max Easley, COO of Petronas. And thank you all for taking time to have this discussion today. So while we are getting rolling, welcome everyone. You will see in the chat function for our participants and our audience today, the little bit of instructions from our folks. We are going to use Slido to let you ask questions of the panel and let you look at each other's questions and vote them up and down. So please, by all means, contribute some of those questions during the discussion. I'm going to take our panelists through a few questions that I'm hopeful will be of interest to the audience and get us rolling. Everybody ready? This should be a great panel. So I have the pleasure of being in a unique position in terms of spending a lot of time in not only the real economy, which all of you represent, but also in our investment community. And what I'm really excited about today is in every sector of our economy, there's different pathways and there's different obstacles to net zero. And over the last 12 months, I would say we've seen those conversations start to shift. As we've seen inflationary pressures come in, we've had geopolitical instability, energy security concerns, and overall sustainability. So as we launch into this topic today, I'd really like to root our conversation in the real economy of Canada and what each of you represent, and take into account those headwinds and those macro topics I think are going to be of interest. So I'm going to start with asking, what strategies are oil and gas companies employing to reduce emissions? And maybe more importantly, how is that energy trilemma of sustainability, cost, and security influencing your strategies and your actions? And Mike, perhaps I'll kick that one over to you first to start.
Sure. Well, let me speak a little bit about the strategies being employed. The trilemma, as you call it, is a very real concern, and I think we're going to be sprinkling that topic across the entirety of this panel, but I'll speak specifically about strategies that we're undertaking on the pathway towards net zero. The energy sector is on the front lines of this, rightfully so, and I think that in Canada, in particular in the oil sands, we are a high emission sector, and so we are properly looking at this in our strategies. And I think all oil and gas companies can manage these strategies in two large buckets. One is reducing the emissions profile of your existing business, and two is to invest in other businesses which have a lower investment profile, or sorry, emissions profile. And Suncor is doing a bit of both. On the emissions reduction side, the oil sands is a highly emissions intensive sector, largely because we have to use a lot of heat, and it's in the generation of that heat where you have large emissions. And so you can try and exchange heat for some other form of process. And so we use things like solvents in situ rather than using steam to liquefy the bitumen and pump it up to the surface. You can look at solvents. Trying to make that economic would be a large emissions reduction activity. We're looking at that. But if you can't get off of heat, how do you make your heat more emissions sustainable? And we have, reducing, changing out a coke-fired boiler for a natural gas-fired cogeneration equipment is an example of that, of fuel switching, large emissions footprint reduction there. Or the other one, if you just can't get lower emissions as part of your processes, we have carbon capture and sequestration, and Suncor is part of a 6-company joint venture in the Pathways to Net Zero's alliance. And that is 6 of the largest oil sands companies getting together to try and work with governments, indigenous governments, provincial governments, federal governments, to try and create a large infrastructure process of creating carbon transportation and sequestration infrastructure such that each of the oil and gas companies can capture carbon from their facilities to reduce the emission. So that's your base business, but we're also investing in fuels like low carbon ethanol and biofuels, as well as hydrogen. Suncor is already Suncor's largest producer and user of hydrogen, and so we're also looking at trying to create green hydrogen for use in our refinery processes to reduce emissions there as well. So those are some of the strategies that we're employing.
That's an excellent basket of investments. Max, can you share with us what Petronas is investing in and what sort of strategies you're employing?
Sure, Shelley. That was good, Mike. Just to bring a more operating flavor to it. As an operator, and some of this is new and some of this is not new. I've only been in Canada 1 year. I've worked all over the world, in the United States and international. When you enter an operation with a goal of reducing emissions, the 3 things you're looking at, first is flaring. So are you burning hydrocarbons that you could otherwise be selling? And through time, you're seeing a lot less of that. Being a gas producer here in Canada, you wouldn't expect much flaring because that's your saleable product. Some places in the world, it's an associated product and people choose to flare it. But what you're really trying to do is eliminate routine flaring. And then from there, you try to maintain reliability so you have less process flaring. And I'm proud to say over the last 5 or 7 years, Petronas has reduced the flaring intensity by 22% from a small figure. So once you achieve that goal, the second one is fugitive emissions. So where do you have methane leaking from cold vents, from tank hatches, or flanged connections? Because methane, as you guys all know, is a much more intensive greenhouse gas than CO2. And so over the last 7 years, same time, we've reduced that by 50%. So once you get through those 2 items, the big one shows up, which is power. So in the upstream, you consume quite a bit of power to compress gas, to pump oil, to run your facilities. And the idea is to get off of fossil fuels for your primary power. You have 2 choices for that in British Columbia. You find electricity from a renewable source, and British Columbia has quite a bit of hydro, or you sequester your CO2. You capture it off of your exhaust gas and you inject it into the ground. And that one is by far the biggest emitter of the 3. And here at Petronas, a lot of success in number 1 and number 2. And number 3 is one we're looking at right now. And we're a very large leaseholder. It's nearly 1 million acres, 50 TCF of gas to be produced. So this would be a large scale project. And the question is, which one makes the most sense to electrify, to carbon capture and sequester, or both? And rather than sitting around and thinking about that, we're actually in action on this. So we'll be trialing technologies in the field this year to demonstrate that that is a viable thing to do. And that's just the upstream perspective. As Mike said, the exam question in this world is this an opportunity or a cost? And the answer is both. And the opportunity side, being a better operator makes you more attractive, but also there's a whole new spectrum of energy to be produced through a different form. And like every other energy company, Petronas is very active in what that could look like. In fact, there's an entire segment of the corporation to be segmented for this purpose alone.
Excellent. And Leah or Trevor, is there anything you'd like to share in terms of what Tourmaline or Enbridge are doing in this space?
If it's okay if I jump in, actually, it's a good segue from what Max was talking about. Tourmaline and Petronas have similar operations in the upstream. But one thing that I will note is that despite the fact that we both produce natural gas in the upstream, our abatement pathways are going to be a little bit different, just inherent in the geology where we operate, the availability of electrification. So I think what needs to be recognized is that every operator, even within industry subsectors, have different abatement pathways. And I don't think what's really understood well by a lot of people is how committed we all are individually into going down those pathways, whatever they may be, and they differ by operator, like oil sands to natural gas, conventional oil to natural gas, and even within natural gas. And so at Tourmaline, we are doing a lot of the similar things. We're abating via looking at our pneumatics and our pumps. Methane monitoring is a really, really big part of the work we're doing right now. And we are also similarly looking at combustion emissions. But while we're looking at those more difficult and novel solutions like electrification or CCUS, it's all hands on deck to reduce emissions across our operations in whatever way we can right now via continuous improvement. So, for example, the big thing that we're looking at right now is replacing higher CI fuels with lower CI. So CI is carbon intensity. So we're basically trying to displace all of our diesel with natural gas, in most cases our own natural gas. And that is a 30% win right there. That's where we're focused on the early cheap wins right now. And we actually made really good progress there. On the energy trilemma, before I pass it off, if it's okay if I just hold the stage for just a second, we actually view natural gas as being a really critical solution in the question of how do we solve the energy trilemma. It is abundant, reliable, and affordable. And at the end of the day, even in the most aggressive net zero scenarios, the natural gas wedge of the energy stack continues to grow through 2050. And in Canada, we're producing incredibly sustainable natural gas, and we see ourselves as being part of the solution.
Yeah, maybe I will agree with everybody in terms of there's the pathways, right? The decarbonization pathways are both similar and different. And we're in the midstream largely. We have oil and gas pipelines. We have a gas distribution business in Ontario, and we have a renewable power business that's in North America, but also offshore in Europe. And so different pathways for sure, but maybe just touching on the trilemma, I don't think the calculus changes so much, right? We know that we need to achieve net zero. And I think what it does is it sort of underscores the energy fundamentals, supply and demand fundamentals, and what I think they've been pointing to for quite a while, which is that, you know, the path to 1.5, if you're going to achieve it, and we do need to achieve it, you know, you have to find ways to decarbonize traditional energy. And so I don't think that much changes. And so what I would focus on is something that maybe doesn't get as much attention, which is the plumbing internally. Like every company is doing so much work to change all the plumbing across the entire organization to ensure that we meet these targets, right? So, you know, the targets are critical. So we set those at Enbridge in late 2020, net zero and an interim target. But then, you know, each business unit develops detailed plans to decarbonize. And you know, there's a prioritization framework, a marginal abatement cost curve developed. We've linked executive and employee pay to emissions reductions. You know, we've reimagined our capital allocation framework to ensure that new investments are aligned with our targets. Sustainable finance, a powerful message internally and externally that your finance is aligned with your ESG goals. And then we've even reorganized and created, I'm now in the new energy technologies team, and really focused on those new energy technologies, but also the integration of emission reductions with that effort. So just wanted to shine a light on all the work that's going on behind the scenes that people don't necessarily see all the time.
Oh, I appreciate that. And maybe I'll take that a little bit tangentially. And I think you've each spoken about what you're doing kind of within sphere of control, which regions you operate in, what businesses you have. If we kind of walked up one flight of stairs, and I think back to the recent Canadian Chamber of Commerce report around how we get there matters, establishing a path to net zero. Net zero is a destination, but its path to get there, I think, was an important message of that. There's so many moving parts that need to go into an effective and orderly, inclusive transition and pathway towards net zero. So we've had developments in different policy areas. If I come outside of your organizations and say, what are the environments you're operating in? You know, we've seen the 2030 emissions reduction plan, input tax credits for carbon capture, regulatory interventions. My question for each of you, and I'll ask you to sort of keep this one a little bit headline, is how would you characterize the current net zero policy landscape in Canada as relates to the oil and gas industry? And, you know, if you've got anything specific of what's either really hurting or really helping, as we move towards 2030 and 2050. I think that would be of extreme interest to our audience. And
I can start
with Leah. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think the headline there is it's confusing and a little bit unstable, actually reasonably unstable, layered, pancaked, and sometimes even contradictory. So we're in a situation where we knew where we were going. We were making good progress. Tourmaline, for example, as Canada's largest natural gas producer, we've reduced our Scope 1 emissions by 41% since 2018. That is incredible. And that is based on existing policy and regulations. And we were making progress, all hands on deck, as I mentioned. And then the layering of all of these new policies and the uncertainty it creates has actually created a lot of uncertainty for us in how we go forward. So we had actually had a lot of momentum, and we feel that the momentum is actually being held back now because of all of the uncertainty. A good example of that is if you look at one of our big initiatives, which is diesel displacement, and you look at, and this is kind of a little bit ancillary to our core business, but if you look at heavy haul transportation, you have a situation where folks who build and drive and operate in the heavy haul transport sector, which supports our sector heavily, they don't know if they're going to be able to use an internal combustion engine, if they're going to be compelled to go to hydrogen. And so to us, the easy win there is go to natural gas, move from diesel to natural gas. As noted, you're reducing a lot of pollutants and you're also reducing your emissions by roughly 30%, 25 to 30%. We could do that now, but the policy uncertainty is causing people pause. So that is just one example of many. Another really good example is methane. The existing methane regs had barely even come into effect and then they got changed. And we don't know what we're looking at. And our current take on the methane policy framework that's been proposed is that it will slow us down. And we've actually been saying that. If anybody else wants to jump in.
Yeah, I can pile on that one, Leah. It's a good summary. I would start being a new Canadian. I would say, first and foremost, I think it's well intended. And the intentions are similar to what you would see from Petronas and many other companies. But it is rather unstable. It seems to be a lot of carrots up front and a specter of big sticks in the background. And a lot of the things we're describing over the long term are very capital intensive. And this has to compete for capital other places around the world. And it seems to me, when I do the math, using a reference point that we're using, it really incentivizes the bad actors. So the people who, as Leah said, and same with Petronas, have spent a lot of effort on this, have a very difficult starting point. So we're disincentivized relative to others to invest here in Canada. So I think the intentions are great, but I really wanted to stabilize so the investment climate is clear, so you can make large capital decisions for the long term. In our case, 4-decade, multi-generational development. To make investment decisions like that, you need some degree of predictability.
Maybe I'll jump in there because I like both of those. You've got good intentions but confusing, and I think that pretty much sums it up, right? And I think that policy making in Canada is very difficult because we can't quite agree on the goal, right? We know that the Paris Agreement says it's about reducing emissions, but somehow we've kind of got this proxy for reducing emissions, which has become, get off of fossil fuels or electrify everything. And I think, that was in some ways quite helpful as a frame early on, but I think it's sort of cutting against its goal now. And, so eliminating emissions or by getting off fossil fuels, I want to be clear about this, that is one way to do it. It's not the only way, and it's not maybe the most efficient way or even the most reasonable way. And so I think what that has a tendency to do is to limit innovation to a certain component of the energy system. And it's not allowing for the innovation that we truly need to achieve 1.5 degrees. And so I think there's a bit of a rethink there. And so just in the flavor of offering solutions, and it's not my solution, it's something that's underway, is I think to short circuit that confusion and to land on a sort of an agreement about what we're doing. I think we need a made in Canada or made in North America transition taxonomy or green taxonomy, what's in, what's out. And I think it's really, there's a bit of a movement toward, limiting sustainable finance to sort of what I would call only the greenest of the green, and keeping existing industry out of it and traditional energy out of it. And I think that would be a really big mistake, given that wedge that Leah was talking about of the global energy mix that continues to be comprised of traditional energy, despite such great gains by renewables and new energy technologies. So that's probably where I would go with that.
That's interesting. I also witnessed that conversation in the investment community around the categories of investment and the green taxonomy. I think it's a very interesting conversation. Mike, is there anything you want to add on that? Because I had one for you that might sort of put the global side of this into play as well.
Do you want to ask your question to frame my comments, or would you like me to start?
You fire away, and then I may choose to follow up and zing you with an extra question.
Yeah, well, I would just first vehemently agree with my panelists. They stole some of my comments as well. I think framing where we are at, like, we have a very nuanced and delicate global energy ecosystem is what I would call it. It's taken 170 years from kind of kerosene to get here. And what we're attempting to do is to rewrite and rewire that delicate balance in under 3 decades. Like, that is a tall order. And some of the things that have worked well are some of the sticks, which I think are appropriate sticks. I think it leads to what Leah was talking about previously, is like how everyone is doing it and how much advances we have made and how willing we all are. And that's only because it's a ubiquitous message amongst all, like, insurers, bankers, energy companies, like, everyone feels it. And so everyone moves kind of in the same direction. That's how you get advancement. And we need to continue to do that. I think maybe more carrots would incentivize a little bit broader avenue there. But I also think we can really advance policy by looking at it in the proper frame, which is within that global ecosystem. So some of what Leah said as well is part of the solution is tackling the global emissions problem. We really do look at it in postage stamp ways. And I think Canada is looking at trying to solve a Canadian issue or even a more localized issue. And that's how we track it. We look at, provincial emissions, national emissions, where this is a much more global issue and has much more global consequences, because we are in a localized economy as well. Like, so there's a lot of geopolitical tension, as we all know, that weighs into this. And by moving these levers a little bit without that acknowledgement, you can have, like, really large unintended consequences we need to be careful of.
Well, maybe we can tug on that thread a little bit with the next question, and perhaps I'll start with you on this one, Mike. Is if I think about that numerically and empirically, our oil and gas sector is arguably 25% of our domestic emissions, but it's less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So when you put that lens on it and say there's this tremendous work happening, but within sort of a postage stamp on a much bigger map or piece of paper, how should Canada be approaching that disparity in terms of, our relative influence in the global sort of scales on this versus what our domestic situation is?
Mm-hmm. That very much an acknowledgement of, the postage stamp element is that you could be wildly successful and get your postage stamp now to zero, and it actually doesn't have a very large influence on the global output. But where I think we could expand our influence is to consider the global ramification of things like emissions reduction that go beyond our borders, getting credit within our borders. That's a little bit of what I'm talking about, of an acknowledgement of the global impact we have here, and also acknowledging the journey as well as the destination. I think a lot more time has to be has to be spent building the platform that we are moving towards rather than eroding the platform we are on. And I don't think we are really acknowledging that we have to work at both of those. And those are moonshots to get a platform that is worth getting off of fossil fuels. So in this very long journey to get from this current platform to that next platform, I think we have to think about what are the incremental steps to get there. So things like switching from one fuel to another isn't off of fossil fuels, but it is progress. And as we go along that path, that is a global issue that I think Canada can do a lot better job of playing a role in on an international stage.
Excellent.
I can pile on that one, Shelley. And don't paint all Canada with one brush. Just British Columbia gas. Canada LNG is, if not, it's amongst the lowest, if not the lowest emission LNG in the world. So you think through the energy trilemma. Number one, energy security. Canada has potential of a lot of customers looking for energy security, and Canada is among one of the most geopolitical stable countries in the world. So you've got the cleanest LNG in a very geopolitical stable arena. What we don't want to do is the third leg of that stool, make it cost prohibitive. Will people pay a premium for it? That hasn't happened yet. They might. We just want to make sure that we maintain all three of those. And I think Canada can be a big part of the Asia Pacific energy mix. And by entering that mix, make the mix a lot cleaner.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think LNG clearly needs to be in the broader mix, but this is something that we can do across Canada's entire economy. It doesn't have to be limited to oil and gas, right? We've got these plans, and I know why we focus on Canada's nationally determined contributions in Paris, and in some ways that makes great sense. In other ways, it doesn't quite account for the reality. And Canada's an exporting nation, right? We happen to be located to the world's biggest consumer market and have access to the to three oceans and the ability to pivot even as geopolitics changes. So we're in a great position, and the work that we're doing to get to net zero across the economy, not just in the oil and gas sector, is important work. But it seems to me that the piece of the equation that's kind of missing is that export component, right? It seems to me that a low carbon export strategy makes a ton of sense, right? And it shouldn't be confined to, rare earth minerals and automobiles. It needs to include LNG, and because it makes a massive difference globally in terms of emissions. And so I think if Canada truly wants to be a climate leader, we need to set our sights higher. So yes, the stuff we're doing, but let's look abroad and think about how we can actually tackle that 98.5% of emissions that are occurring outside of this country.
And if I could just build on what Trevor was saying, I wholeheartedly agree with everything that all the other panelists have said, especially on exports. At the end of the day, emissions don't have borders. And if I bring it back to the conversation I kind of was touching on earlier about why aren't we tackling the lowest hanging fruit in our own operations within Canada and then also globally? And the lowest hanging fruit right now is that 1 gigawatt of coal-fired electricity that's being built every 48 hours that is still happening. And it's because they don't have access to a reasonable supply of LNG. And Canada has a solution for that. We just need to get out of our own way a little bit.
Well, I think maybe what we'll do is to take that last sort of theme all four of you had and talk about something that I'm proud of as a Canadian in terms of the partnerships and the collaborations that I think we've seen emerge around how do you tackle some of these really difficult problems, because no one party, government, private sector, energy sector, or other can solve this problem by themselves. And each of you and your organizations are involved in some partnerships around this. So my question for you is, when you think about the size and the scale and the gnarliness of the challenges that you've just described, what are Canada's oil and gas companies doing with other industries or with each other to help meet some of these goals? And I'm really curious, what other parts of transition do you think are going to need this kind of enhanced collaboration? And what should the rest of us be expecting in terms of the shape and the flavor of partnership initiatives that are going to be necessary to achieve what we're trying to do here? And maybe I'll start this time with Mike.
Yeah, I think partnering is part of the evidence of that earlier policy narrative gone well. If all industries and all companies within all industries see this as a challenge that needs to be addressed, all financiers, all insurers, all investors, all suppliers, all see it as there aren't winners and losers by some advancing and others not. Everyone needs to advance, and I think the Pathways to Net Zero's alliance among the oil sands normal competitors coming together to share this thought process and investment in the shared infrastructure is a good example of policy done right. We also have partnerships with like ATCO and other entities outside of our normal industry, where we're partnering on hydrogen projects as well when there's cross benefit for it. So I think it's evidence done well, and I think that will only continue as the focus of emissions reduction starts to proliferate along the entirety of the value chain and agriculture, consumption, and onward.
I can pile on this one. The question is, when are you a competitor, and is it in your best interest to cooperate? It's the exam question for enterprise, and I think we are in this arena probably more aligned to cooperate than be true competitors. But I remember in the North Sea, as a history lesson, everyone was trying to decarbonize offshore, and everyone had their own scheme to do that, to basically run power from the beach. And very quickly it became apparent that was capital prohibitive. It would make all the mature platforms uncommercial. And the operators actually couldn't pull it together. The midstream actually bridged that gap. So the midstream created a consortium to make that happen. And what I'm getting toward here is common infrastructure is very capital intensive for these kinds of things. And I think it's probably in our best interest to cooperate on common infrastructure than everyone to build their own, be it CO2 or be it electrification, whatever it is. Eventually, we're all going to come to the conclusion we need to collaborate on that, or we're going to find it capital prohibitive. And also in technology happens very, very quickly. And most of this technology is provided by the service sector, startups and whatnot. And that gets commoditized very, very quickly. So to assume you're going to have a proprietary advantage on that is a bit naive. So the faster we can proliferate that technology, I think, for mutual advantage is a good thing.
I actually think if I can build on that a little bit, shared infrastructure and collaborating in terms of capital, if you kind of take a different frame on that and you look at the impact on the land in upstream production processes. So when you have to build a road, when you have to build a lease site in order to undertake your operations, the requirement to preserve biodiversity and also honor treaty rights is really critical as we go forward in resource development in this country right now. And at the end of the day, that is going to require producer collaboration. So we have been collaborating like never before. We already have been, and that actually is just going to become even more important as we move forward, for example, in the new agreements that have been put in place in BC. And that in and of itself, the new agreements I'm talking about are an incredible collaboration between different stakeholders. So the agreement that the Blueberry River First Nation and the government of BC just announced in the last couple of weeks is an incredible example in partnership in resource development and economic reconciliation in this country. It's also really critical in partnering and protecting the environment. We now have the First Nation communities partnering with us in our operations as we move forward and benefiting from those operations. So
that's a great point, Leah. I think all those roads lead to the same point, reading the tea leaves, but we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, love all the points that joint co-panelists made. A lot of uncertainty in not so much in the renewable space anymore, but in the new energy technology space. But as you're building sort of that optionality into your business, those new platforms, we've partnered on everything that we've been doing in that space, right? It's just the way that it's happening. And part of that's sharing risk, given that uncertainty. Part of that's learning new businesses. And I love the point about Indigenous economic reconciliation and the opportunities with what I would call non-traditional partners to advance new energy technologies and decarbonizing existing businesses is a very powerful combination.
I think there's so many powerful themes to take from this discussion, but I just saw Catherine pop on, which means I think I might be getting told I'm monopolizing the question time with the four of you. So, Catherine and team, I am unable to actually see the questions. So perhaps I can get a tiny bit of help in terms of what questions we've had come in from the audience that's with us today.
For sure, Shelley. The first question that came in through the audience is, what is happening to energy in Europe? How does this impact Canada?
Wow, that's a big question, isn't it? Well, I think Europe really underlines the energy trilemma. 24 months ago, there was only one leg to that stool, which was sustainability. And I think energy security and cost of energy have raised major issues in Europe. And I think it's refocused everyone that you have to focus on all three legs of the stool to get a truly sustainable solution.
And I think I would add to that is that what's happening with energy in Europe, it's a global ecosystem. So you can't disassociate what's happening in Europe from what happens in Canada or anywhere. And I think it underscores affordability and availability of energy is a basic right that we have all come to understand. And when you see a disruption, it really brings that to the forefront. I find cheap and affordable energy is much like health, like personal health. It is much more noticeable in its absence than it is in its presence.
Yeah, geopolitics has reemerged dramatically in the energy space. It's always kind of been there, but it's in the public, knowledge of it as well. And relying on Russia for so much energy. And not having diversified supply and has been a big lesson for that all countries should take, frankly. And I think that the geopolitical map is being, redrawn everywhere. So what's happening in Europe is, as Mike said, can't be disassociated from what's happening everywhere else. And I think increasingly we're getting this fragmentation. And I was kind of chuckling because my daughter's in high school right now, and she's taking a class on globalization, and the textbook's from 2004, and I was reading it, and I was sort of like, a lot of this stuff is not relevant anymore, right? The map is being redrawn. There are regions like blocks of trading partners that are going to reemerge, and so we're getting a different world here.
Wonderful. I think we probably have time for one more question before we need to send these folks off to a break before their last session of the day. So what's the best question you've got in the queue, Catherine and team?
All right. So we've got, how will the internet connectivity play a role in reducing the carbon footprint of the oil and gas sector?
Leah, do you want the first word on this one?
I actually missed the first part of that question. Can you repeat it?
For sure. It's how is the internet connectivity be a part of the oil and gas?
I'm sorry, I still can't hear you. Does somebody else want to pop in who could understand it? No, I'm sorry, I couldn't understand the question still.
I believe it was internet connectivity.
Internet connectivity. Oh, okay. That is a tough one. Actually, what I will say is there have been a lot of advances in satellite monitoring technology, so not necessarily internet connectivity, but I will say we have been able to leverage satellite connectivity to help us with our monitoring and reporting and comparisons of our domestic emissions and methane profiles to international profiles. In terms of internet connectivity, it really creates a lot more efficiency in our operations on the ground as well, which is one of the ways that you continue to drive down emissions. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, but.
Yeah, I think that's how I would have answered it too, Leah. I think access to the internet is kind of old school. The question is, what do you do with that telemetry in that rapid data collection? How do you modernize our operations to make them more reliable and more energy efficient, and that's happening big time. And without that sort of data telemetry, internet connection, that would be impossible.
Yeah.
You have 1970s oil field.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key things that we struggle with reporting emissions data and gathering emissions data and forecasting emissions data is the reliability of that and the timing of gathering that data. And so, as you move from a world in which data and emissions typically was collected for regulatory purposes the subsequent year to a world in which you're trying to get to real-time collection of that data, that's a prerequisite for being able to do that effectively.
So unfortunately, it looks like we're running out of time. So I'd like to say a big thank you to all of our panelists for being part of the discussion today. I do think it's one of the most important and dynamic conversations, both in Canada here at home and around the world. And it's time for us to turn not only you loose, but the audience loose for one last break before closing the session today. So folks, if you can take probably 9 minutes, I think you're expected to be back at 2:35 p.m. Eastern, and you're not going to want to miss this because your final session is with a Canadian business icon who I think many of us admire, Arlene Dickinson. So thank you very much for joining the panel and I today, and to the panelists, fabulous dialogue, and thank you. And enjoy the rest of the session. For all of you, take care, everyone.